Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything, and do it not only when their eye is on you and to win their favor, but with sincerity of heart and reverence for the Lord. All who are under the yoke of slavery should consider their masters worthy of respect, so that God's name and our teaching may not be slandered. Teach slaves to be subject to their masters in everything, to try to please them, not to talk back to them, and not to steal from them, but to show that they can be fully trusted, so that in every way they will make the teaching about God our Savior attractive. The Bible is not concerned with liberating slaves. In fact, these verses tell slaves to keep their mouths shut and remain obedient, so that the gospel message can spread more easily without the threat of an uproar over things like freedom and equality.
The Aborigines were deemed to be subhuman, little more than animals, which was to justify not only the theft of their land, but their extermination. An edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica, still in circulation when I was at school, described them as only an animal of prey, more ferocious than the leopard or the hyena. He devours his own species. So they were hunted and raped and massacred, and few doubted at the time that genocide was official policy. A government report in the 1850s spoke of the success of poisoning Aborigines, 100 of them laid out at a time. But until quite recently, little of this was even acknowledged. In Tasmania, the Aborigines were said to have died out. In fact, they were hunted along with kangaroos and almost wiped out. In New South Wales, by 1845, the tribe who had watched Captain Cook sail here into Botany Bay was reduced to 3 women and a man. In Victoria, an Aborigine called old Mr. Burt recalled this story told by his mother.
They buried our babies with only their heads above the ground. All in a row they were. Then they had a test to see who could kick the babies' heads off the furthest. One man clobbered a baby's head off from horseback. They then spent most of the day raping the women. Most of them were then tortured to death by sticking sharp things like spears up their vaginas until they died. They tied the men's hands behind their backs, then cut off their penis and testicles, and watched them run around screaming until they died.
One of the most enduring myths about the Aborigines is that they did not fight back. In fact, a war of resistance lasted more than a century, some of it here on the banks of the Hawkesbury River, north of Sydney. During the 1930s, my father built a cottage here, on the beach at an Aboriginal place called Patonga. I think we knew that somebody had lived at Patonga at some time, but no one talked about it. In fact, an entire nation had lived here on and off for thousands of years. They were called the Jurag, a unique Aboriginal people, tall and slender, whose country extended to a 40-mile radius north of Sydney, and the mighty Hawkesbury River was theirs. And when the British established the town of Windsor in the early 1800s, a great war began. This war was not recorded in the Imperial Chronicles of Australia. Growing up here, I knew nothing about it, and I suspect that's still true of the people in the smart beach houses here today. And yet the Jurag inflicted on the British a casualty rate greater than that sustained by the Australian Armed Forces during all of World War II. And finally, after 22 years, outnumbered and without guns, they went down fighting to the last man, woman and child, a complete nation. Today, in a land of many cenotaphs and war memorials on which invariably is written, "Lest we forget," not one of them stands for those who fought and fell in their own country. By the 1920s, the British invasion had caused the deaths of at least 250,000 black Australians. Genocide on a massive scale. But this fact remained suppressed, except in the living memory of those who survived. Here in the Northern Territory, in the great isolated heartland of Australia, the killing of Aborigines continued well into the 20th century, and most of these also remained secret. However, in 1928, 150 miles from Alice Springs, a gang of police and cattlemen massacred at least 50 Aborigines, perhaps many more, and word got out. A public inquiry was held, and its findings were summarized in these 3 words: the shooting was justified. In giving evidence, Constable William Murray said, "We shot to kill. What use is a wounded blackfella 100 miles from civilized Australia?" The nation on the other side of the frontier has risen from its deathbed and has begun to fight back. And what a spectacle it is. As the first Australians challenged some of the greatest transnational companies in the world, and governments, and historians, and assumptions and attitudes, and disease and neglect, in order that they may claim back their share of the oldest continent, their country. This film is a glimpse of their epic story. When Captain Cook landed here in Botany Bay, he was under orders not to raise the Union Jack without the consent of the inhabitants of Australia. But Cook and Captain Arthur Phillip, who followed with the first fleet of convicts, both disobeyed these instructions. And what followed was one of the darkest and least known periods in the history of Britain's empire. The British declared Australia an empty land, in spite of the fact that there were tribes with a total population of at least 300,000, perhaps as many as 1 million. No one knew exactly, because the first Australians were not counted as human beings. Decimation was swift. Aboriginal blood carried no resistance to white disease. Lieutenant Brady, Royal Marines, reported in 1788, "From the great number of dead natives found in every part of Sydney Harbour, it appears that the smallpox has made dreadful havoc among them." But not nearly as much havoc as massacre. No British colony was born under so cruel a star as Australia. The early convict ships had brought thousands of white slaves, mostly English and Irish, transported for crimes of poverty and politics. And they became the instruments of massacre, directed by Christian gentlemen who had brought with them attitudes of racial superiority that were the staple of empire. Ironically, their cruelty was at odds with liberal reformers in Britain who were then seeking to end the slave trade. In 1837, a House of Commons Select Committee condemned the atrocities against the Aborigines. But the difference between sympathy and action was a convenient 15,000 miles.
I am calling a corroboree of all the natives of New South Wales to send a petition to the King in an endeavour to improve our condition. All the black man wants is representation in federal parliament. There is also plenty of fish in the river for us all, and land to grow all we want. 150 years ago, the Aboriginals owned Australia, and today he demands more than the white man's charity. He wants the right to live.
At that time, the 1930s, the Protection Acts were in full force. The Chief Protector had the power to send mixed-blood children to missions, having wrenched them away from their Aboriginal mothers. In this way, the mothers could continue to serve their white masters, the masters were saved any possible embarrassment, and the children were civilized with Christian ritual. If any Aborigine objected to this arrangement, the Chief Protector could imprison him or her without trial, all of which, said the law, was to save the natives from being overwhelmed by the white race. In recent years, many of those children sent to the missions have tried to find their families.
Well, the first time with me, as the story goes, is my grandpa said, "You don't take that kid," you know, so I was left. He stopped him, but then the following year, months later, he came back again, and then I was out with some other kids, and most of the old people had gone away from the station. And so Constable Bill McKinnon was able to take me, put me on the camel and take me, you know, till people realised the day after or the 2 days after that I was missing.
My brown skin baby, they take him away. Between her sobs, I heard her say, "Police."
What does the Bible say about slavery? Amazingly, the Bible gives instructions on how to buy slaves, who to buy as slaves, and how to treat them. From Leviticus 25:44 through 46. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can will them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. Exodus 21:20 through 21 gives instruction on how to beat your slaves. If a man beats his male or female slave with a rod and the slave dies as a direct result, he must be punished, but he is not to be punished if the slave gets up after a day or two, since the slave is his property. You can thrash them within inches of their lives, but make sure you don't directly kill them.
Been taking my baby away from white men, boss, that baby I have. Why he let him take baby away? Yeah.